Charlotte Pembury did not flinch when her stepmother named the price. She stood on the second step of the Pembury Hall portico, in the gown Lady Constance had chosen for her. Pale rose silk, but it belonged to a long-departed aunt, 3 years out of fashion, and 1 inch too tight at the ribs, and listened as her own person was added to the bill of sale. £2,700, Lady Constance said. Her voice lifted for the gravel court below. The May sun caught the false brightness of it. The full sum of Sir Edmund's outstanding debts. To clear them, he is willing to part with the unentailed contents of the Western Library, the late Lady Pembury's mare, the carved walnut dowry chest with its contents, and, in token of how serious our charity has become, the responsibility of his elder daughter's future. Whoever takes the lot takes Charlotte. A laugh went through the crowd, assembled in the gravel court. It was not a kind laugh. Charlotte counted it. 23 people. 11 gentlemen of the neighbourhood, with the soft, bored faces of men who had come to see a humiliation and discovered it would be served with claret. 4 of her stepmother's friends, 3 creditors, Mr. Pratt, the Reading auctioneer, on the lower step in his grey coat, looking at his polished boots as if he could not be quite asked to look at her. Genevieve, at the edge of the steps, with both hands pressed to her mouth, performing horror she did not feel. Sir Edmund, her father, somewhere in the doorway behind her, already drinking. The May wind moved through the hawthorn at the edge of the gravel and carried the white and green smell of it across the court. Charlotte concentrated on that smell. She straightened the cuff of her left sleeve. She had been straightening her left cuff for 25 seconds when Lady Constance, encouraged by the laugh, decided to turn the screw. "It is a joke, of course," her stepmother said sweetly. "But Charlotte does come with the lot. I should not like there to be confusion later. 26, unmarried, accomplished in cataloguing and household economies. And I'm told," here a gentle, surgical pause, "she does not weep easily. Whoever takes us at our price will not be exhausted by sentiment." The laugh that followed broke against Charlotte like a wave that had been rehearsing for hours. She did not weep. She did not move. She did not look at her father in the doorway. She looked at Mr. Pratt's grey coat, and at the polished toes of his boots, and at the small, miserable way he held his hammer, and she understood that no one in this courtyard had expected her to remain standing this long. £3,000, said a voice from the gate. It came from the south side of the court, from a man on a tall black horse who had not been there a minute ago, and the moment he spoke, the laughing stopped, as if a door had been pulled shut. He was perhaps 28, broad through the shoulders, in a dark riding coat the colour of a winter river, and he sat his horse the way a man sits a chair he has been using for a decade, without performance. His hair was unfashionably uncombed by the ride. His mouth, neither smiling nor not smiling, gave nothing. 3,000, he said again. Cleared today. The lot as listed. All of it. He swung down from the horse and tossed the reins to the boy at the gate without looking, and the air in the gravel court went out of every lung at once. Charlotte heard a creditor at the back say, "Christ," under his breath. She heard her stepmother say nothing, which was extraordinary. "Sir," Mr. Pratt began, recovering. That is to say, your name, sir, for the receipt." "Ashborne," the man said. He climbed the 3 shallow steps as he spoke. "Tristan Ashborne, of Ashborne Park. Your hammer, Mr. Pratt, if you would." He took the hammer from the auctioneer's hand. He did not glance at Lady Constance. He did not glance at the laughing gentleman. He looked once at Charlotte. A look that lasted perhaps a quarter of a second, quick and entirely level. The look of a man checking that a thing he has been thinking about is still there. And then he brought the hammer down on Mr. Pratt's wooden block with a crack that ran along the gravel. "Sold," the Duke of Ashbourne said. He laid the hammer on the step. He drew a folded banker's draft from his coat and pressed it into Mr. Pratt's hand. He turned, then, and looked properly at Charlotte for the first time. His eyes were the dark grey of slate after rain. "Miss Pembury," he said, "have you anything in the house you cannot bear to leave behind?" She was, for one absurd half-second, on the edge of laughing. Not because anything was funny, but because in 3 minutes a stranger had silenced her stepmother, paid her father's debts, and asked her what she wished to take with her, as though the lot of items being sold below the steps did not include herself. "My mother's prayer book," she said. Her voice was very steady. "The grey mare, and a small carved horse from the south writing room. Nothing else." "Then if you will permit me 20 minutes, the Duke said, "I will see your possessions packed, your stepmother's signature on the assignment, and the carriage at the door. Your father's debts are now my own concern. I would prefer not to spend the afternoon in this courtyard discussing them." He bowed, a bow so precise it bordered on an insult to Lady Constance, and turned to settle the legalities with Mr. Pratt. Charlotte stood on the second step of the portico. The hawthorn smell came through the courtyard again. Her left cuff was, she noticed for the first time, perfectly straight. She did not weep. She did not look at her father. She looked at the back of the Duke of Ashbourne's dark river coat, and she thought very clearly, "I do not know who you are. I do not know what I have just walked into. But I will not be paid for, and I will not be given. We will find that out together, you and I." The carved horse from her uncle's writing-room shelf was no larger than her palm. She fetched it herself. The carriage that took her away from Pembury Hall was a plain travelling chaise with the Ashborne arms quietly painted on the door, and the Duke rode beside it on his black horse. He did not attempt conversation through the window. He had said precisely 4 sentences to her since the hammer fell, and 3 of them concerned practical arrangements. It suited Charlotte. She needed the 4 miles to Ashbourne Park to put her hands back inside her own gloves. Her stepmother had not said farewell. Her father had not appeared at the door. Genevieve had cried noisily in the entrance hall and been waved off by a footman. The household servants had stood in 2 silent rows in the gravel court, 14 of them, who had known Charlotte all her life, and one of them, old Mrs. Hatch, the housekeeper, had pressed a packet of seed cake into her hands, with hands that were trembling, and whispered, "Miss Charlotte, that gentleman has been to this house before, twice, when Master Henry was alive." And Charlotte had stored that sentence away to think about later, when she had stopped reciting the multiplication tables under her breath in order to keep upright. Master Henry, her uncle, Lord Henry Pembury, gone these 8 years. The Duke had paid £3,000 for her father's debts and taken her away in a covered carriage, and her uncle's name had been spoken in the same hour. That was a sum she could not yet reduce. She watched the green hedgerows through the window. Late spring rain had been promising itself for days without arriving, and the air was thick and pale and full of the smell of cut grass. The carriage took the turning onto a road she had never travelled. After 3/4 of an hour, the road opened, and Ashbourne Park rose at the far end of an avenue of beech trees in their first soft green. A long, low Caroline house of warm grey stone with a river at the foot of its lawn. It was, Charlotte thought, a deeply embarrassing house. Not ostentatious, only beautiful and clearly happy and lived in. The Duke was at the carriage door before the footman could lower the step. "Miss Pembury," he said. "Mrs. Hartley is the housekeeper. She will show you to your rooms. There is hot water, there is supper, if you can manage it. There is no one in the house but my own people, and they have been told only that a young lady is my guest. You will not be looked at. You will not be asked questions. I will be in the steward's office with my man of business until 8 o'clock, settling the documents from this morning. If you require anything, ring for it." She inclined her head. "And tomorrow?" He paused. The slate-grey eyes considered her with the same level quietness they had used in the courtyard. Tomorrow, he said, you may ask me whatever you wish, and I will answer it. Until breakfast, I think we have both done enough talking for one day. Your Grace. Tristan in the house, he said. Your Grace will only complicate matters. She felt, for the second time that day, the entirely unnecessary impulse to laugh. She did not. Then you may call me Charlotte in the house, she said, on the same principle. Good night. She walked past him into Ashborne Park. Mrs. Hartley was a plump, dignified woman, with a face that had been rehearsing kindness all the way from the housekeeper's room. She did not falter when she saw Charlotte's 3-year-old gown. She conducted her up a wide oak staircase to a yellow bedroom looking southeast over the park and the river. She pointed out the bell. She mentioned, with the air of a woman releasing valuable information, that Mr. Whitcomb, the cook, produced a remarkable lemon posset if Miss should be partial. She withdrew. Charlotte sat down on the edge of the bed and discovered that she was, in fact, partial. She unwrapped the carved horse and set it on the dressing table where she could see it from the bed, and she went to the window. Beyond the lawn, the river ran fast and brown with last week's rain. A single black horse, his, she recognized, was being walked along the gravel sweep below by a groom. The horse turned its head as if it had been listening for something. The man at its bridle laughed and patted its neck. The whole picture had a domestic ordinariness that Charlotte found more disorienting than the morning's auction. She had been delivered, she understood, into a household that did not know yet what to do with her, but knew, without question, that she was not for sale. She washed her face. She ate 3 bites of the lemon posset. She slept 11 hours like a stone dropped into a well. When she woke in the morning, the rain that had been promising itself had finally come. It made the yellow bedroom feel like the inside of a bell. She lay still for a moment, listening to it, and then she sat up with absolute composure and rang the bell, because she had 4 questions she intended to put to the Duke of Ashbourne over breakfast, and none of them would be easy. He was already at the breakfast table when she came down, coat off, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow on muscular forearms, tan from the riding, a half-read book set face down beside a plate of cold meat, and he stood at once when she entered. Charlotte, he said, as if they had been friends for a year. Tristan. She arranged her grey morning gown over the chair he held for her, sat, and accepted coffee from a footman who managed the entire business of pouring as though no part of yesterday had occurred. My questions, when you are ready. He looked, briefly, amused. Before tea? Before tea. She straightened the cuff of her left sleeve. First, you have been to Pembury Hall before, twice in my uncle's lifetime. Is that correct? The amusement went out of his face entirely. He set down his cup. Yes. Second, my Uncle Henry was kind to you. He was the man who taught me to read Latin, he said quietly, and to ride at the trot without breaking my back, and to value precisely those people whom my own father had ranked beneath consideration. He was kind to me, yes. He was the principal moral education of my life. Charlotte took that in without showing him she had taken it in. Third, she said, did my uncle, before he was gone, request of you any particular care of his niece? The silence that came after was, for the first time since she had met him, a silence that contained difficulty. He looked at the rain on the window for a long moment. Then he looked at her steadily. Yes. Specific terms. That if your father's affairs ever passed beyond his own management, I was to step in. That if you ever required a place to go, you were to be welcomed at Ashbourne Park. That I was to use my own judgment as to whether you were to be told. And you have used your judgment. I have used my judgment for 8 years, he said. You have not in 8 years requested anything of me. Yesterday, when I learned what was being arranged in your father's gravel court, I considered that judgment irrelevant. Charlotte set down her cup. She had expected 1 of 3 answers, and he had given her the truest of them, plainly, without softening. "Fourth question," she said, "and then I will eat the kedgeree." "Ask." "Has it been only my uncle's request in those 8 years that has kept you mindful of me?" He looked at her. She had asked the question because she had to, because Steel Rose did not leave questions unasked when the asking might cut. Because she had once, at a winter's distance, seen a young man walking the Dorset moor with a fishing rod over his shoulder when she was 18, and had asked her uncle whose son he was, and had received an answer that lodged itself somewhere quiet and refused to be dislodged. Because she had been thinking about that distant figure for a long time. Because she suspected he had been thinking about her in return. And because, if it had been only the promise, if it had been duty, charity, an old pledge, then she would eat the kedgeree, and thank him, and arrange her own employment by the end of the month, and never speak of yesterday again. He answered her the way he answered everything, quietly, exactly, and with no protective fog around the words. "No," he said, "it has not been only your uncle's request." "Thank you," Charlotte said. She picked up her fork. She ate the kedgeree, which was very good. The rain went on against the window. The Duke of Ashborne watched her for a long, considering second, and then he laughed. A single, surprised, unguarded laugh that sounded as though it had been waiting in his chest for several years to be released, and the whole texture of the morning rearranged itself. "You are," he said, "the most efficient breakfast companion I have ever sat across from." "I am told I do not weep easily," she said. "Apparently it makes me restful." "Good God," he said helplessly. "I am also told I do not ration butter, but you cannot have everything in one sitting." "Charlotte." "Yes?" "You are not at all what I had braced myself for." "I should hope not," she said. "I should hate to think I had been braced for." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. The slate-grey eyes had the look she was beginning to find more and more difficult to translate. Somewhere between alarm and admiration, with a third unidentified ingredient. And he set the cup down with the careful deliberation of a man who has decided not to say the thing he was about to say. "More coffee," he said instead. "More coffee," Charlotte agreed. That was the beginning. By the end of the first week, she had drawn up a contract. She had written it in her own hand at the small Pembroke table in the South Library, 3 close-written pages on Ashborne writing paper, and she had handed it to Tristan after dinner with the calm of a clerk presenting a bill of sale. "I cannot accept," she said, "a charity whose terms were dictated by a man who is no longer here. Nor can I accept a charity whose other terms have not been spoken aloud. So we will have a contract, you and I, with terms of my drafting. You may amend it, you may reject it." He read the contract by candlelight at the long oak table, while she watched the pulse beat in the side of his neck. She was offering him this. She would catalogue the entire Western Library of Ashbourne Park, which had not been catalogued in 2 generations, at a fee of £2 a week, paid retroactively at the end of 3 months. She would also examine, audit, and, where necessary, recompute the household accounts and the accounts of 2 outlying tenancies, whose stewards had been quietly skimming for at least 18 months. She had identified this, she noted in a footnote, by spending a single afternoon with the books while he was riding out, at a fee to be agreed on the basis of monies recovered from these earnings, plus any sale of a portion of her late mother's books, which the Duke might have purchased and have no personal use of. She would, by quarterly instalments, repay the £3,000 he had laid down for her father's debts, calculated at 4% simple interest in his favour. In return, the Duke was not to make her any gift. He was not to settle on her any sum. He was not to introduce her to society as a connection of his house, until she should have repaid at least 1/3 of her debt. He was to grant her free use of the library, full board, and a horse to ride. He was to address her with the same plainness he had used in the gravel court and at this morning's breakfast. He was to permit her, when she wished it, to go. "The 4% interest," Tristan said, In your favour, Charlotte said. Yes. Charlotte, there is no interest. There is now. He laid the contract on the table. The slate-grey eyes had the look she was beginning to know, the look of a man choosing among 3 possible answers and rejecting the easy one. This is an absurd document, he said. It is a serious document. It is both. He stood abruptly and walked once the length of the long oak table and back. He placed his hand flat on the contract. He did not look at her when he spoke. You understand that there is no version of this in which I treat your work as a debt repayment, rather than as work I am genuinely paying for. The 2 outlying tenancies, Coombe Farm and Holwell, I have suspected of fraud for 6 months and have not had the time to disentangle. If you find me what is missing, I shall consider the 3,000 discharged before September. That is unacceptable, Charlotte said. Unless you also agree that I am in fact a competent auditor, and that you would, in any other circumstance, have hired me. He looked at her then. The candle stood between them. The rain had not stopped since the morning of her arrival, and the library smelt of old wax and wet stone. Charlotte Pembury, he said, if I had known, 6 months ago, that there existed in Berkshire a competent woman willing to audit my outlying tenancies for £2 a week, I would have walked the 4 miles to Pembury Hall and proposed the arrangement to your father in person. Then we have no quarrel. We have a great quarrel, he said. You have not told me whether the 4% in my favour is your idea of a joke, or your idea of a punishment, or your idea of a self-respect device. All 3, said Charlotte. He laughed again, that same surprised, helpless laugh of the breakfast room, and he sat down heavily and pulled the contract toward him and signed it without further argument. We will quarrel about the interest later, he said. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, the South Library. Bring the Coombe Farm books, bring the Holwell books. Bring whatever it is you straighten your left cuff for, so that we may begin with you in full possession of yourself. How do you know I straighten my left cuff? Charlotte? Yes. I have, he said, been paying very close attention. She did not answer that. She gathered her contract, her candle, and her dignity, and she went up the oak staircase to her yellow bedroom, and she sat for a long while at the window, watching the rain run on the river. The carved horse on the dressing table watched her back. For 3 weeks they worked. The South Library at Ashborne Park had a deep window bay that overlooked the river through 3 tall sashes, and it became, by tacit agreement, Charlotte's working room. The Duke had a secretary's desk brought in for her. He laid out the Coombe Farm books on the largest reading table. He stocked the inkwell. He left her alone for the mornings and joined her after his ride, and they worked side by side in the long afternoons, in a silence that was, increasingly, not a silence at all, but a kind of conversation in which the 2 of them passed papers across the table and made small marks in pencil and occasionally said, "Look at this," in voices that meant, "We have caught the steward." There was, Charlotte observed by the 3rd day, a 4th presence in the library. He was an enormous fawn-coloured wolfhound named Magnus, 14 years old, 3/4 blind, of profound dignity and intermittent enthusiasm, who had been the Duke's shadow for the better part of a decade, and had, on the 2nd afternoon of Charlotte's tenure, transferred his loyalties without consultation. Magnus came into the library in the morning behind the Duke. Magnus lay down beside Charlotte's secretary's desk. Magnus, on the rare occasions when the Duke left the room, did not follow the Duke. Magnus put his enormous head in Charlotte's lap and went peaceably to sleep. "That dog," Tristan said on the 5th afternoon, looking down at his own animal with an expression of betrayed astonishment, "has not voluntarily attached himself to a new person since 1808. "He is very discerning," Charlotte said. "Magnus?" The hound did not lift his head. "Magnus, I am the man who feeds you." The hound sighed. It was a sigh of considerable depth. It was not, Charlotte felt, intended unkindly. "Charlotte," the Duke said gravely, "I am being humiliated in my own library. I cannot be held responsible. I shall require, in compensation, that you read the Combe Farm rentals aloud while I drink my coffee." "That is not in the contract." "I am amending the contract." "You may not unilaterally amend the contract." "Magnus, support me." Magnus snored. Charlotte read the Combe Farm rentals aloud. The Duke drank his coffee. The river ran. The rain, which had not yet ceased since the day she had arrived, made a sound on the 3 tall sashes, like applause from a great distance, and Charlotte realized, somewhere in the second column of figures, that she was happy, in a specific and uncomplicated way, for the first time in 8 years. She did not stop reading. She made a note of the realization, mentally, the way she made notes on the rentals. She would deal with it later. They caught the steward on a wet Wednesday morning. His name was Mr. Joll. He had been transferring a percentage of the Combe Farm rent receipts to a private account in Reading for 19 months, and Charlotte found him in the books by the simple expedient of comparing the rentals against the parish poor rate assessments, which any honest man of business would have ensured matched within £2. They did not match. They did not match by £27 in the spring quarter alone. She brought the discovery to Tristan in the steward's office. She laid the 2 ledgers side by side. She did not gloat. She tapped the column with the end of her pencil. "There," she said. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at Charlotte. He said, "Right," and went out and got on his horse and rode the 4 miles to Combe Farm, and dismissed Mr. Joll before luncheon. He came back with rain on his shoulders and a small, satisfied set to his mouth, and he found her in the library with the carved horse from her uncle's writing room placed on top of the Combe Farm ledger as a paperweight. "Where did you get that?" he said. She had set the carved horse there idly that morning, because the books would not lie flat in the damp. "From my uncle's writing room, the day after he was gone. Aunt Sophia was throwing things into a charity sack, and I rescued it." "Why?" The Duke looked at the small wooden horse for a long moment. He did not pick it up. "He gave me one exactly like it," he said, "for my 15th birthday. Carved by a Mr. Edmonds of Lyme Regis, identifiable by the way the mane is cut into 7 distinct strands. There are 11 of them in the world. Your uncle commissioned the lot. I have never seen another outside my own bookcase." Charlotte looked at the horse. She looked at Tristan. She looked at the rain. "How many strands?" she said carefully. "Of mane?" "Count them." She counted them. 7. "Oh," said Charlotte. He sat down opposite her at the reading table and put his face briefly in his hands. He did not, as a less disciplined man might, attempt a speech. He looked up after a moment, and the slate-grey eyes were entirely candid. "I think," he said, "we will have to admit to one another that the whole business has been going on rather longer than either of us wished to confess." "Possibly. On my side, since I was 20, and your uncle showed me your sketchbook." "On mine," Charlotte said, with great evenness, "since I was 18, and saw you with a fishing rod on the Dorset moor, and asked my uncle whose son you were." "Henry knew." "Henry knew everything." "Yes," Tristan said. "He did." The rain went on against the 3 tall sashes. The river ran fast and brown below the lawn. The carved horse stood between them on the Combe Farm ledger. "And after my uncle was gone," Charlotte said, "what did you do?" "I waited." "For what?" "For the prior arrangement," the Duke of Ashborne said quietly, "that my late father had made for me with another family in Hampshire, to be unmade. By the lady's preference, not mine. It was unmade in November of last year. I was on the point of writing to your father in March to request an introduction, when your father's debts began to make themselves known to my agent. I had intended to write in May. I was a fortnight too late." A fortnight. Possibly less. She looked at him. She thought of the gravel courtyard. She thought of the laugh that had broken against her like a wave that had been rehearsing for hours. She thought of his black horse at the gate, and his hammer crack on Mr. Pratt's wooden block, and the 4 sentences he had given her in the carriage, and the kedgeree, and the contract, and the rain. "Tristan," she said. "Yes." "Do not say anything more, just yet. I am not ready to hear it. I am, however, going to require you to look at me without flinching for a long minute. And then, I am going to require you to leave this library, before either of us makes the mistake of saying something we cannot say at 3/4 of the proper time." He did not flinch. He looked at her for the long minute. Then he stood, bowed precisely as he had bowed in the gravel courtyard of Pembury Hall, but to her now, only to her. And he walked out of the South Library and shut the door. Charlotte sat at the reading table with the carved horse between her hands. She straightened the cuff of her left sleeve. She did not weep, but she was, she discovered with mild scientific interest, smiling at the ceiling, alone, at 4:15 in the afternoon, in a way she had not smiled in 8 years. Magnus, beside her chair, opened one milky eye, considered the situation, and went peaceably back to sleep. They did not, after that, refer to it for a fortnight. It was not avoidance. It was, Charlotte recognized with the same precision she had used on Mr. Joel's ledgers, a deliberate observance of the contract. He had agreed to address her with plainness. He was. He had agreed not to introduce her to society as a connection of his house until she had repaid 1/3 of her debt. He had not. He had agreed to permit her, when she wished it, to go. Twice in those 2 weeks he had said, in the small, quiet voice he used only when speaking to her, "Charlotte, if you wish to leave, the carriage is yours by the hour." And twice she had said, with the same small, quiet voice, "Not yet." They worked, they rode, they quarrelled mildly about the 4% interest. They quarrelled less mildly about a passage in Cicero. The household at Ashborne Park, watching from the kitchen and the stables and the housekeeper's room, decided, collectively and without comment, that the Duke had brought home a woman who was not for sale, and that the appropriate thing to do was to put fresh flowers in her room each morning, and to cease asking questions. They rode out together for the first time on a Sunday, after 2 weeks of rain finally ended, and the May country dried under a high, pale sun. The grey mare from Pembury Hall had been brought over with Charlotte's books. She was a quiet 11-year-old animal of considerable patience, who had been Charlotte's mother's, then Charlotte's, and whose gait was so smooth that Charlotte had once read a chapter of Mrs. Radcliffe in the saddle without losing her place. They rode east along the river path. Magnus, who could no longer keep up at a canter, was permitted to lie in state in the library for the afternoon. Tristan rode the black gelding of the gravel court. He sat the horse the way he sat everything else, without performance, and he did not speak for the first half-mile, because he was not a man who hurried his sentences, and because he was, Charlotte was beginning to understand, pacing himself by a metronome only he could hear. "Charlotte." "Yes?" "There is a thing I have noticed about you that you may not be aware of. Probably several, but name one." "You straighten your left cuff," he said, "when something is going well and you are concealing it. You straighten your right cuff when something is going badly and you are concealing it. The left has been doing all the work since Tuesday. I thought you might like to know." "That is a profoundly impertinent observation." "Yes." "Is the right ever going to be allowed to participate again?" "That," he said, "is between you and your right cuff." She laughed. Not the dry, intellectual laugh she gave at the breakfast table, a real laugh, surprised out of her by the absurdity of being studied at the level of cuff. The grey mare, pleased, lengthened her stride. The black gelding, infected, did the same. Tristan turned in the saddle to watch her laugh, and the look on his face was, for one entirely unguarded second, the look of a man who had been waiting for that specific sound for 8 years, and had not been certain it existed. He recovered. He was a steadfast man at heart, and a patient flame by long discipline, and he did not let one unguarded second turn into 2. He looked back along the river path. He pointed out a heron in the rushes. He returned the conversation to the safer ground of Holwell tenancy. But Charlotte had seen the look. She filed it away beside the realization about the rentals. She would deal with it later. Old Mrs. Hatch, the Pembury Hall housekeeper, wrote Charlotte a letter at the end of the 4th week. A careful, wobbling letter that said only that Lady Constance had taken to her bed for a fortnight, that Sir Edmund, having found 2 small private notes the auctioneer's list had not accounted for, had quietly settled them out of the new quarter's rents, and was now making arrangements for the London season. That Genevieve was being measured for a new ball gown and was to be presented at the Forsyth Assembly on the 2nd of June at Reading. I thought you should know, Miss Charlotte. I do not know whether it concerns you. It did concern Charlotte, profoundly. She read the letter twice. She walked down to the South Library, where Tristan was deep in a paragraph of estate correspondence, and she laid Mrs. Hatch's letter on top of his page. He read it. He looked up. Reading Assembly, 2nd of June. Yes, Charlotte said. You wish to be there. I wish you to take me there. He did not ask why. He had been paying close attention. On what terms, Charlotte? The contract specifies that you shall not introduce me to society as a connection of your house until I have repaid 1/3 of my debt. We have, between Mr. Joel's exposed accounts at Coombe Farm and the recovered sums from Holwell, recently exceeded 1/3 of £3,000. By a margin, she said, of £4 11s. You have done the arithmetic. I have done the arithmetic. Then, the Duke of Ashborne said gravely, we shall go to Reading. He did not smile. He did not need to. But Charlotte saw, as he turned back to his page, the small private satisfaction in the corner of his mouth. The satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for permission to stand publicly beside the woman he had been quietly attending to for 8 years, and had been given it, with paperwork. She did not weep. She went upstairs, and she took out the pale rose silk gown her stepmother had forced upon her on the morning of the auction, and she folded it neatly, and she gave it to Mrs. Hartley, with instructions that it should go to the parish arms room by the next post. For the Reading Assembly, she would order a new gown. Saffron silk, she thought. Something that would carry across a ballroom. The Forsyth Assembly at Reading was held in the long white ballroom of the Black Lion Inn, a ballroom that had once received George III and had been growing steadily quieter ever since. And the Pembury party arrived shortly before 9 o'clock in 2 hired carriages with a great deal of unnecessary noise. Charlotte was already there. She stood at the upper end of the ballroom in saffron silk that caught the candlelight on the silver thread at the cuffs, with the Duke of Ashborne at her left elbow in dark, formal evening dress. And behind them, Tristan had been quietly and lethally efficient about this, the Earl and Countess of Wickham, Mrs. Featherstone of Highclere, and the Bishop of Oxford, all of them standing within easy nodding distance of the Duke, and being introduced, one by one, to Miss Pembury, niece of the late Lord Henry Pembury, my dear friend, in the tone of a man making a public statement. When her stepmother saw her, Lady Constance went the colour of a candle that had been burned to its socket. Genevieve, who had not been informed of where Charlotte was, gave a small, audible squeak. Sir Edmund, deep in his glass, said something Charlotte could not make out, and the Bishop of Oxford turned politely away from him, in the way a bishop turns away from a man whose breath has reached the point of social currency. The room had been talking in the ordinary low candlelit way of a country assembly. It was not, suddenly, talking quite so freely. Lady Constance recovered first. She came up the long ballroom on her husband's unsteady arm, with the tight, brittle smile she had worn in the gravel courtyard, and she said, in a voice trained to carry, because she had not in 3 weeks understood that she had lost. "Charlotte, my dearest girl, we had not been told you were in Reading. Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. The Duke of Ashborne, in our very assembly. What a charitable gentleman you have proven yourself, taking up our poor—" "Lady Constance," Charlotte said. It was the first word she had spoken in the room. Her voice was very steady. The Bishop of Oxford turned his head. "Yes, dear. It is good to see you. I had thought, after the events of the 2nd of May, that you might find public assembly fatiguing. May I make some introductions? The Bishop of Oxford, the Earl and Countess of Wickham, Mrs. Featherstone. This is my stepmother, Lady Constance Pembury of Pembury Hall, who arranged the auction of my person on the 2nd of May to clear my father's debts of £3,000. She is also my half-sister Genevieve's mother. My father, Sir Edmund, you may know." The silence that followed was not a country assembly silence. It was a silence with weight in it. The candles in the ballroom seemed, for one absurd half-second, to burn lower. Lady Constance opened her mouth, closed it. The Bishop of Oxford said, with terrible gentleness, "I beg your pardon, Lady Constance. The auction of—" "It was, of course," Lady Constance began, an entirely conventional, a private domestic arrangement, an estate sale to clear certain unpleasant—" "It was held publicly," Charlotte said, "in the gravel court of Pembury Hall. There were 23 witnesses. Mr. Pratt of Reading conducted it. The lot consisted of my late mother's books, the grey mare, the carved walnut dowry chest with its contents, and myself. The hammer fell at £3,000, paid in full by His Grace. I will undertake to provide a sworn statement to anyone who requires it." "Charlotte," Sir Edmund said hoarsely. "Father." She did not turn her head. She did not raise her voice. "I am not at this moment speaking to you. I have not spoken to you in 3 weeks. I am not certain when I will speak to you again. You may stand here and listen, or you may go and find a chair." He went and found a chair. "Bishop," Charlotte said, "I do not wish to embarrass an assembly. I wish to make 4 facts clear, because I have noticed, in 3 weeks of country gossip, that they have been imperfectly understood. The auction took place. I did not consent. The sum was paid by a friend of my late uncle's, in fulfillment of an entirely separate moral obligation, and I have been employed since the 3rd of May at Ashborne Park as an auditor and cataloguer, on a contract of my own drafting, repaying the sum at 4% simple interest in His Grace's favour. I have currently repaid 1/3. I am not at this moment a connection of His Grace's house. I am, as my contract specifies, his employee. Any social inference contrary to that is, until the remaining 2/3 are repaid, entirely premature." She paused. The candles burned. "And now," Charlotte said, "I should very much like to dance." The Earl of Wickham stepped forward, with the agility of a man who had been waiting for his cue all evening, and bowed. "Miss Pembury, if you will do me the honour." "Thank you, my lord," she said. She handed her fan to the Duke without looking at him. She placed her hand on the Earl's arm. She walked the length of the long white ballroom on the arm of the Earl of Wickham in saffron silk, past her stepmother, who could not now move, past her half-sister, who was trying not to cry, past her father, who had sat down on a small gilt chair and was holding his hat in both hands. And she took her place at the head of the country dance. Behind her, she heard the Duke of Ashbourne say, very quietly, to the Bishop of Oxford, "It is a remarkable young woman." "It is," the Bishop of Oxford said, "an extraordinary one." When the music began, Charlotte straightened the cuff of her left sleeve, smiled at the Earl of Wickham with absolute calm, and danced. After the dance, the Duke claimed her for the second. After the second, he claimed her for the supper. After supper, he took her quietly out onto the small flagged terrace at the side of the Black Lion Inn, where the river ran past the back of the building under a wrought-iron lamp, and the May night was warm and full of hawthorn, and they were entirely alone for the first time in a public place. He did not, even now, hurry. "Charlotte." "Yes." "You did not need me in there." "I did not need you in there to deliver the speech," she said. "I needed you in there so that the speech would be heard. There is a difference." I had not understood the difference. "You understand it now?" "Yes." "Tristan." "Yes." "I have been meaning to inform you," Charlotte said, "that the 4% interest is going to bankrupt you within 9 years, if my arithmetic is correct, and that I am therefore going to have to either reduce it, accept a faster repayment schedule, or marry you. I have been trying to decide which solution is most consistent with self-respect." He looked at her. The slate-grey eyes had the entirely candid look she had come, in a month of mornings, to know better than her own. "And which," he said, "have you decided?" "None of them," Charlotte said. "I have decided to permit you to ask me, and then I will tell you my answer." "Charlotte Pembury," the Duke of Ashborne said quietly, "will you do me the honour of marrying me, on terms of your own drafting, at 4% simple interest in your favour, for the rest of my natural life?" "I will think about it." "Charlotte." "Yes?" "I love you." "I know," Charlotte said. "I have known for a fortnight. I was going to permit you to say it tomorrow morning over kedgeree, but you have, on the whole, spoiled the surprise." He laughed. He laughed properly, the surprised, helpless laugh of the breakfast room, the one she had been training him to release more often. He took her face in both his hands, gently, as he had taken the reins of his black horse on the gravel court without performance, and he kissed her under the wrought iron lamp at the back of the Black Lion Inn, in saffron silk, in May, with the smell of hawthorn coming off the river. She did not weep, but she allowed herself, at last, to lean into him a fraction farther than her own composure had ever permitted. She allowed herself to feel the warmth of his coat, the steadiness of his hand at the back of her neck, the small, unnecessary care with which he had positioned himself between her and the open terrace door. She allowed herself, for one specific minute under the wrought iron lamp, to be entirely held. It was not weakness. She had recognized, somewhere between the kedgeree and the carved horse, and Magnus's sigh and the saffron silk, that there were several distinct kinds of strength, and that allowing oneself to be steadied by a man who had been quietly waiting for 8 years to do it correctly was one of them. "Charlotte," he said when she drew back. "Yes?" "Would you tell me your answer now?" "I should hate to be predictable." "Charlotte." "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes. Did you imagine for a single moment I had ridden the grey mare 4 miles in your direction every Sunday for 3 weeks for any other answer?" "I had hoped." "You had hoped correctly." He kissed her again, briefly, formally, as if he had a great many years ahead in which to do it less formally. He offered her his arm. They went back into the long white ballroom of the Black Lion Inn together, and the Bishop of Oxford, who missed almost nothing, observed the manner of their re-entry, and said quietly to the Earl of Wickham, "I think we shall have a wedding before the harvest." "Before the wheat, certainly," the Earl agreed. They were married in the small parish church at Ashborne 3 weeks later, on the morning of the longest day of the year. Charlotte wore not saffron, but ivory. Mrs. Hartley had insisted, and Charlotte, who had developed in 8 weeks an immense respect for Mrs. Hartley's opinions on every topic except book cataloguing, had yielded. And the wedding was a quiet one, witnessed by the Earl and Countess of Wickham, the Bishop of Oxford, and old Mrs. Hatch from Pembury Hall, who had walked the 4 miles in her best black bonnet, and would not be persuaded into a carriage. Sir Edmund did not attend. He had not been invited. Lady Constance did not attend. She had been invited, once, on a stiff white card that Charlotte had written in her own hand with the precise observance of social form. And Lady Constance, Charlotte was reliably informed, had read the card gone white about the mouth, and quietly removed to Bath for the season. Genevieve sent flowers. Charlotte put them in the small drawing room, and did not write to thank her, but did not throw them out either. There was, Charlotte had decided, nothing to be gained by punishing a girl of 19 for her mother's character. She would write to Genevieve, eventually. Not yet. The carved horse stood on the writing table in the South Library at Ashborne Park, its 7-stranded mane catching the morning light, and beside it, Tristan had quietly produced it from his own bookcase on the morning of the wedding. Its twin, 2 carved horses, one given by Charlotte's uncle to a young man at 15, one rescued by a niece of 18 from a charity sack the day after that uncle was gone, set side by side at last. 20 years and 1 auction, and £3,000 and 4% simple interest after Lord Henry Pembury had commissioned the lot. She told this story to her first child, 4 years later, a small, grave girl named Henrietta, after the uncle who had arranged everything, and her daughter, who had inherited her father's slate-grey eyes and her mother's habit of straightening her left cuff when something was going well, listened with the absolute attention of a child who has understood that the story is true. "And what," Henrietta asked at the end, "happened to the 4% interest?" "It is still being paid," Charlotte said gravely. "In your favour." "Mine?" "Yours." "By Papa?" "By Papa." "For how long?" "For the rest of his natural life. It was in the contract." Henrietta considered this. She straightened, with absolute composure, the cuff of her small left sleeve. "That seems fair," she said. In the South Library, Magnus, 18 years old now and almost entirely blind but still magnificently dignified, sighed in his sleep on the rug between the writing tables. The river ran. The hawthorn at the edge of the lawn was in its 2nd flowering of the year. Tristan, coming in from the steward's office in his shirt sleeves, with a sheaf of Coombe Farm rentals under one arm, paused in the doorway to look at his wife and his daughter, and his ancient hound, and his late mentor's 2 carved horses, and the slate-grey eyes had the entirely candid look they had worn on the morning of the kedgeree. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes?" "I have come to consult you about a tenancy." "Of course you have." "Coombe Farm requires a new roof." "Coombe Farm has required a new roof for 2 years." "Yes," he said, "but I have only now decided to do something about it." "On whose authority?" "On yours, if you will grant it." She looked at him. The carved horses stood between them on the writing table. Henrietta, 4 years old and already a person of formidable internal discipline, had tucked herself against her mother's side and was watching her father with the steadiness of a small adult. "Granted," Charlotte said, "on terms of my drafting." "At 4%. "At 4%. "In whose favour?" "Ours," she said, quietly. "In ours." He crossed the library and bent and kissed the top of his wife's head, and then, with great care, the top of his daughter's. The Coombe Farm rentals he laid on the writing table beside the 2 carved horses. Magnus, hearing him, opened one milky eye, considered the situation, and went peaceably back to sleep. Outside the 3 tall sashes, the river ran fast and quiet under the long midsummer light. The hawthorn smelt as it had smelt in the gravel courtyard at Pembury Hall on the 2nd of May, the year Charlotte Pembury had not flinched when her stepmother named the price. She straightened the cuff of her left sleeve. She did not weep. She did, however, smile, briefly, entirely, in a way she had once thought she had lost the capacity for, at the small, carved horse with 7 strands of mane that Lord Henry Pembury had given to a duke's son in 1806, and at its twin, and at her husband, and at her daughter, and at the long, quiet domestic afternoon of her own remarkable, unsold, unbought, freely chosen life. If you have ever been priced by people who had no right to set the value, and stood quietly through it because there was nothing yet to be gained by speaking, and then watched a stranger walk into the gravel courtyard and pay the wrong sum on purpose so that the bill would never come due to anyone but him. Leave a comment with the moment in this story you saw it most clearly. Subscribe if you would like another Fireside story this Sunday. And until then, pull your chair a little closer to the fire if the evening is cold. There is a kettle on. There is always one more story.